The Path of Exile 2 boss fight changes are absolutely wild. During most of Path of Exile 1's run, especially while its acts were being created and released, its bosses were uninspired. It's an obvious truth that the only bosses that shine in Path of Exile 1 are its act bosses, some of its pinnacle bosses, and a select set of its league boss fights. Every single Path of Exile 2 boss I've seen is the opposite, which is awesome. We have Diamora, the Song of Death, also known as Merveil as she should have been. Then there's the Mastodon and the Death Lord of Black Rib Pit, a duo with a name so metal I want to start a band right now and start blasting. We also have Krutog, Lord of Kin, a proper giant in Rayclast who has a belt of human bodies. If you thought Headhunter was gory, meet Krutog. However, we're not discussing the difference between Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 boss gameplay design in this video. We're also not analyzing the 23 different boss fights we've seen snippets from Path of Exile 2. Instead, we are examining all the systemic changes to boss fights, designs, and rewards confirmed to be arriving in POE2 and what endgame bossing in POE2 might look like. Traveling Exiles, welcome! I am Talkative Try. Let's talk some Path of Exile 2. There are two defined versions of boss fights in Path of Exile 1. Graverushing during the campaign, and the 6-portal strategy during Endgame. During the 10-act campaign in Path of Exile 1, when we die during a boss fight, the boss does not reset, and we can merely walk right back in. This allows us to brute force a boss, zooming back in over and over, taking down 10, 5, or 1% of the boss's health with every death. Unless we're particularly terrible at PoE or just completely out of our league when battling a boss, this allows almost everyone to clear any campaign boss in the game, even if it means taking 150 deaths to clear Act 10 Kitava. Bid this strategy a fond farewell come PoE2. In Path of Exile 2's campaign, we need to bring a boss from 100 to 0 in a single go. Graverushing is destroyed as a strategy. When we die against a boss, the boss resets to 100% health. That's a huge change. Likewise, this should affect boss fights in PoE2's endgame. Presently, when we are downed in PoE1, we simply lose a portal, but do not lose any progress against the boss we're fighting. Across 6 PoE1 portals, this allows us to chip down a boss like Graverushing, albeit with less attempts. As far as I understand it, if we die in PoE2 against bosses during endgame, we lose portals and progress, a double whammy. This is how Last Epoch handles all its bossing activities, and it has been a joy to experience. It really spurs you to focus on every boss mechanic and decipher how your character can overcome it without making a single mistake, or coming to understand when you can and when you cannot afford to make a mistake. It's refreshing and it has been a blast. The Majasa fight on screen now is the current final boss of the campaign. I love it. Do note, we've honed in on dying during boss fights, but we are still able to escape boss fights in PoE2 in 2 ways, although both are far less powerful than they used to be. Firstly, we can portal out of boss fights in PoE2, but portal use in PoE2 is not instant. It has a 2.5 to 3 second cast time only in boss battles, and if you get hit, the cast stops completely. Portaling out allows us to gather our thoughts, reset our flasks using wells, and prepare for the next phase of the boss fight. But we'll need to stay wary. Our portal disappears once we enter it and engage the boss once more in their arena. Secondly, we can still log out during boss fights in PoE2. However, it's just a brief reprieve. Once we log back in, we'll be right where we left off, whether it's in the middle of a massive boss attack or a terribly compromising position somewhere else in the boss's arena. That's right, it's time to finally say farewell to logout macros everywhere. Hardcore players beware, especially Quinn69. Additionally, this ability to actually instantly log out manually and save the game will save many characters from lag-infested deaths, which is a good thing. Oh, and there's one more fight-related bossing change in PoE2. Boss staggering. Crowd control abilities can now be used meaningfully on bosses. Every boss has a unique staggered animation, and various crowd control types will affect bosses differently. This means stun, freeze, slows, and other abilities typically used for pack fights will actually be utilized when bossing. Every boss will have a unique window. Some bosses will be stunned for 3 seconds, others for 5 or 6. We were able to see how freeze worked during the Path of Exile 2 gameplay showcase at ExileCon 2023 in this fight here. Then again, in both the Volcano Giant fight and the Reveal on Steroids fight, we were able to see stun staggering. It's just another layer added on top of how we can bring down bosses with a variety of builds. Sheer damage might not always be the way. Conglomerated, bosses resetting on death, portals requiring an actual cast time during boss fights, instantly logging out saving and pausing the game, and boss staggers drastically revamp how we'll be fighting every single boss in Path of Exile 2. It's going to be a massive shift between POE1 and POE2, and some of us might not be ready for it. I am. One of my favorite gameplay elements of POE1 right now are the boss fights, especially the ones located in its endgame, floating around the Atlas and the new League mechanics. Uber Elder, the Maven, the Eater of Worlds, Lycia, I'm a fan of them all, and it seems like every single one is inspired by the design of bosses in POE2, or vice versa. And these bosses will be taking center stage. Due to these boss fighting changes, we'll be battling them a whole lot more, and how we fight them will matter massively. That's big and exciting, as are the new known rewards for downing bosses. But before we discuss that fully, I would like to ask, if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the sub notification bell. More content like it is on the way. Thank you for the consideration, and if you do like the video, the support. Alrighty, let's get back to it. Bosses in POE2 are surely going to have unique drop tables as they do in POE1, with endgame bosses containing their own suite of unique items and special rewards. However, there's also a new reward system layered on top of bosses during the campaign and possibly during endgame. For numerous bosses in the campaign, downing them will provide your character with some sort of permanent bonus that isn't related to items. It's statistical. As some quests in POE1 grant passive skill points, some bosses in POE2 will grant passive statistical bonuses. For example, downing the Blind Beast drops the Blood-Soaked Tome. It might grant +10 to Spirit, +25 to Health, or even +5 to all stats. Killing Diamora, Song of Death, might drop the Siren's Tooth, which gives 10% increased mana regeneration. Slaying the Prisoner might drop Izaro's Pain, which grants 5% increased damage, and so on and so forth. This adds an extra layer of character power progression to the campaign, and incentivizes you to kill otherwise optional bosses en route to endgame. However, a player on Reddit pointed out that not everyone will want to do that during the campaign every time. And even though GGG said they will probably cycle which bosses give what rewards every league, it might still get tiring to do this on each character. They suggested if the same boss is in the endgame and the character kills it there, they should get the reward. Jonathan Rogers, the game director of POE2, responded and liked the idea. This sounds great. Additionally, the first time a character kills a boss, that boss will have a huge bonus to item rarity. That should mean, with how POE2 is handling items, it'll drop items that are quite valuable to you. Essentially, what this screams to me is an expanded version of the Bandit Trio quest in Act 2 of POE1, and a hyper-focus on smart loot for POE2's bosses. I'm a fan, and it gives a bit more personality and a direct, concrete reward for beating certain bosses that players would otherwise zoom on past, or just not be able to beat without incentive. Progression through Path of Exile 2, just as in POE1, is going to be locked behind beating its bosses. However, the need to down them from 100 to 0 without dying is going to change the game and possibly the barrier for progression. Gone are the days of ramming your head against a boss you cannot defeat without dying 100 times. Now, players will be forced to think about their characters critically, or gain the superhuman reaction speeds of Ben. That's obviously something GGG is going to be aware of when designing the game. This is key. This is where they can teach players what they need to do to improve their character. It's easier for someone to understand when a single enemy is doing something they cannot overcome versus dozens and dozens of monsters doing exactly that. Take Act 6 in POE1 for example. It's a leap in difficulty for many, especially newer players. Veterans understand that's because lots of the monsters deal high elemental damage, and we just lost a bunch of resistances from downing Kitava in Act 5. A new player might not get that's what's going on and might not be able to progress. Then, take a player in POE2 who is facing a boss they must down from 100 to 0 in one go. They keep dying from a certain attack that is obviously a huge fire blast, or maybe it's a constant damage over time that's nearly unavoidable. They will likely realize there was something wrong with their fire defenses here and try to remedy it. These forced 100 to 0 boss fights lower the variables involved in blocking a character's progress to 1, and that's way more understandable for many players. Grinding Gear Games, of course though, is going to need to be very careful with how they balance these fights. I think it's going to be a good thing, and it's going to work out well and help more and more players get hooked on PoE and trap their soul in the title's endgame. Now on to the topic of endgame bossing. We know 3 things about this in Path of Exile 2. 1, we know the bossing system will be dissimilar to Path of Exile 1's content system of invitations and the like, but it will accomplish the same thing. What does that mean? Well, it's likely that the packaging will be different, but the mechanics will act quite similar. There will likely be fragments obtained by beating lesser bosses that pave the way to harder and harder bosses. Additionally, they've been moving more and more to deterministic methods of finding bosses with the Eater and Exarch, so a system similar to that will likely also be present. I'm curious about whether or not something similar to the Maven's Crucible will remain in the game, a way to bring multiple bosses together and fight them all at once. I am of the mindset that the greatly deepened past League mechanics will play a role here. We know Delve is returning, and I bet favorites like Bestiary will too. What if the Colosseum idea is expanded from Bestiary to include bosses found and captured in maps in some way? That'd be cool. What if it's expanded out to not just maps, but League mechanics too? But then again, how in the world will this work when the wild bosses we know we're getting in POE2 are insane? It's a thought truly to behold. As I see it, Grinding Gear Games is going all out with everything they make for POE2. They wanted crossbows, so they built out multiple types, an entire attachment mechanic with grenades, and even WASD movement. They wanted more archetypes, so they designed 6 brand new classes and a suite of ascendancies to go with them. I expect the same of their endgame systems and everything adopted from POE1, truly. 2. We're going to get pinnacle bosses from the outset, foes like Uber Elder, Eater of Worlds, and the Maven. While they might not be in the beta initially, they'll be there at launch. Remember people, we've only seen area bosses from POE2 thus far. No act bosses, no pinnacle bosses. I shudder to think what either will look like and how interesting their mechanics shall be. 3. Bosses from the campaign are going to be bosses in POE2's version of maps. We still don't know if they will gain modifiers or new abilities when in maps. It's sensible if they'd like to ensure they are more difficult and gain more than just health and damage versus what they were in the campaign. GGG also said they expect map bosses to represent 1/3 of your time and 1/3 of your rewards in maps. Compared to POE1, they will be far more present and involved, as POE1's map bosses, aside from Guardians and the like, are jokes unless they are ghosted and have insane modifiers on them. As someone who enjoys boss fights, all of this is ridiculously exciting. Bosses are going to be more meaningful. They are going to be harder, and there's going to be a greater focus on those epic fights and how we decide to bring them down. With that comes a new suite of rewards, exciting methods to best them, and of course a bunch of endgame systems we're not even certain about yet. One thing's for sure, Grinding Gear Games is an innovative company. They're going to get bossing in POE2 just right. As always, I would like to thank every single one of my generous patrons for supporting my content. If you would like to help this channel grow, my Patreon link is in the description. Thanks for the consideration. Now, while POE2's new boss fights do indeed look incredible, they won't directly impact our characters, while the wild revamped skill gem system will, by quite a bit. Watch my video about the sweeping changes now. It's right on your screen.